Hey folks, thanks for listening. We're going to be talking about some emotional topics today. Suicide, self-harm, emotional distress. If any of these topics are bringing up any difficult emotions, please take a look at the links to supports in our bio and on our website.
It's a Minefield is a weekly audio program where we talk getting the most out of life with mental health challenges, with fun and love to be enjoyed by the whole community.
On It's a Minefield, we speak with well-known and not so well-known Australians about the issues that affect us as we live with these challenges.
It's the mad leading the mad.
We're pretty in sync with each other.
Have you ever been lonely? I certainly have. Loneliness is a universal human experience that is both complex and different for each individual. Loneliness hurts. It can cause people to feel empty, isolated, and unwanted. People who are lonely often crave human contact, but our state of mind makes it more difficult to form connections with other people. Our guest today, Dr. Michelle Lim, knows a lot about loneliness. Michelle is considered the leading Australian scientific expert in loneliness. She is a researcher at the Iverson Health Innovation Research Institute and Centre for Mental Health at Swinburne University of Technology. She's the Director of Social Health and Wellbeing Laboratory, which generates evidence-based research into loneliness. Her research involves understanding the drivers of loneliness over time and developing technologies to reduce loneliness. Dr. Lim is also a practicing clinical psychologist. Michelle, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Leon.
Firstly, what is loneliness?
So loneliness is defined as a subjective feeling of social isolation.
Mm-hmm.
So if you hear the term feeling alone in a crowd, feeling alone in a marriage, feeling lonely but not alone, that is the construct that we're talking about. So
Right.
It's different to social isolation. Social isolation itself is about the number of people you know, the degree of contact you might have, and people who live alone, for example, are thought to be more socially isolated. There's a distinct differences. It's much more obvious to be socially isolated and much less obvious when it comes to loneliness.
I've heard some people saying you can be the most lonely in a crowded city. What do you think about that?
I think that's actually somewhat true. I think that a lot of people have talked about living in very urban cities and apartments where there are lots and lots of people, but the way our environment and our, in terms of urban design, those sorts of things do actually facilitate social opportunities and actually being able to just have that social opportunity to build those meaningful social connections.
Tell me about yourself. Where did your interest in loneliness come from?
That's a very good question. I did my postdoctoral research fellowship in Washington University in St. Louis, and I moved there not knowing anybody.
Right.
And interestingly, I moved there with my partner, so I was not alone, but definitely felt lonely because I didn't have my meaningful social connections with me.
Yeah.
And I actually got into understanding experiences of loneliness and a fear of judgment from other people, which is a social anxiety construct, and looking at the relationship between loneliness and social anxiety.
So it sort of came from that own personal experience of moving to another place and not having the same social connections and support as you did earlier.
Yes, and it's that meaningful social connections that was lacking. And Leon, as you mentioned before, all of us have the capacity to feel lonely because it's actually baked into our DNA. We are social beings. Yep. That's how we thrive and flourish. And loneliness itself is really seen as a signal in our brains to do something different about social connection. That we know perhaps that is a signal for us to find new ones or maybe perhaps improve the existing social connections that we have. Yeah. When we ignore that signal, it's very much similar to, not drinking when you're thirsty and not eating when you're hungry.
Yeah.
we actually starve that social part of ourselves. So that's where, if you heard that loneliness is really, associated with very poor health outcomes.
Yeah.
That's where, when we ignore loneliness, that's where those problems start.
Right. So it's actually hardwired in us.
Yes, absolutely. And that's been very much, based on years and years of research around how we thrive and even our brain, how we actually navigate our environment when we feel like someone's got our back, when we feel like perhaps we have the support of a loved one or support of someone we may not know very well, we're less stressed. And we actually navigate, and we have the ability to cope with more stresses when we feel like someone's got our back.
Absolutely. What is the relationship between loneliness and mental well-being?
That's a very good question. It's very much an antecedent. So we know in my research in the US and in Australia, we know that if you're lonely at the first time point, you're more likely to experience depression, social anxiety, and non-clinical paranoia 6 months down the line.
Wow.
Now, the only thing that predicts loneliness back is actually social anxiety. So if I have a fear of people, I avoid people, and I feel anxious about meeting people, that's also more likely to lead to more loneliness.
Yeah. That's so fascinating.
Well, worryingly, I think that loneliness itself has been linked to higher suicide. So that's something that we need to address better, because it basically says that we can actually do something earlier and address loneliness in a preventative approach to prevent more serious mental health symptoms and also suicidality.
Yes. Right now, we're in another lockdown in Sydney. How has the COVID-19 pandemic affected people's experiences of loneliness?
Well, what we don't know at the moment is the cumulative effect of repeated lockdowns. And of course, you would have different kind of experiences across different cities. In Melbourne, for example, we know that the first 6 months of the pandemic was particularly hard. But what we do know is that people who experienced poor mental health to begin with just recovered more slowly, even if social restrictions were eased.
Right.
So I think what's really important is that our mental health and well-being is really critical. And if anything, these sorts of public health measures that restrict our social behaviors for good reason, to prevent infection, those things do have consequences. And it's really important for us to try to mitigate and buffer the impact of actually not seeing many people. So we really do need to actually up our social resilience and actually our coping strategies around that.
What can Australian governments do to address those emerging concerns around the necessity of social isolation for this virus, but to prevent the deep impacts of loneliness?
Look, I think what's really important, what's really needed is this community awareness around loneliness, because while it's being recognized across the world that loneliness is actually in itself an independent determinant of poor health, our government has not had any kind of strategy around tackling loneliness and social isolation. So we really need to have some sort of national strategy that's implemented, whether it's awareness campaigns, whether it's evidence-based solutions, whether it's about policies that can actually help us nurture meaningful social connection despite, for example, despite us, doing remote working. Those sorts of things are not have not been implemented. And I think it's really important for us to kind of think about why those things are important, because economically we know that people who are lonely actually use more health resources. They go to the doctor more. They get more unwell. They actually have increased risk of cardiometabolic diseases, not just mental health. But yet, there's not really much recognition that this is actually a perfect point of a preventative approach as opposed to dealing with the more difficult health conditions when they actually become chronic.
Yeah. Which sorts of people, what groups of people in Australia are experiencing loneliness more than others?
Look, I think just in terms of the data sets that we look at in terms of both international and national data set, it's very clear that people of lower socioeconomic backgrounds, people who are not financially resourced, are actually more lonely. And in fact, we can see a very clear dose response. The more economically disadvantaged you are, the more lonely you are.
Right.
And it's a very clear trend. There's also another trend which is very, very consistent, which is young people, 18 to 25, and older people around the 55 mark to 65 mark. So before actually retirement, those are two peaks, and could be that there's kind of a social shift during that age group that actually makes them a little bit more vulnerable to feeling lonely.
Yeah. How would you explain those age groups particularly? You've got the younger people, 15 to 24, and the older people, 55 plus. What is unique, or what's different about those two age groups than others?
So not much has been done looking at the predictors of loneliness in the over 55s. So what I might be saying, it might be some of the plausible reasons. So things like unstable employment would be one, and also kids leaving the home as well is another. So it's a change in the family structure are both plausible reasons but have not been investigated. With younger people, that's much more clear. It's really very much around emerging mental illnesses, the transition from high school to perhaps further education or TAFE, vocational training, employment, means that they really have to change their social network while trying to nurture the ones they have, but also trying to make new ones in which they might not feel so comfortable. So some of the ones that they might have to make are perhaps, people who are of a different age to them. How do they navigate that space? And there's also elements of not knowing who they are as a person, and having and that particular age group tends to favor more friends as opposed to fewer friends but deeper quality.
Absolutely.
So and that could potentially play into loneliness.
There seems to be a real paradox right now. Today we may be more connected than ever before digitally, but are we more meaningfully connected?
Well, I think it depends on the person using it. I think we need to have more data, and we're talking about maybe perhaps 2 decades of data for us to look at those trends. I think it's around how you use it. There are some people who use it very much to make new connections, but never actually make those connections transition to real life. There are people who use social media and actually then take those connections and actually translate them, actually meet those people in real life. There are also people who connect or reconnect with people who are, geographically perhaps very far away and reconnect with old friends. And so, social media can be used in a positive way. It can be used in a way that helps you feel meaningfully connected as opposed to just being connected.
It was an interesting time for me, the first lockdown, where for someone who's got lived experience of mental illness, I was really prepared to go pretty bad. And I did a lot of things to make sure that didn't happen, and a lot of work into my well-being. And paradoxically, it was one of the least lonely times of my life, though I was alone. What are some of the lessons we could learn from lockdown from your perspective?
I think for people who have never felt lonely, it was a bit of a surprise for them that for the first time in their life, they felt really the sting of loneliness. They felt that ache, and they felt the desire to connect to even connections that are very much acquaintances. There's this, the mom that kind of somewhat well enough at school when you go pick up your children. People talk about, I miss just having that, kind of organic conversation, the conversation that you might have with the person that makes your coffee every morning. Those little kind of organic type interactions that you didn't think would make the difference actually did make a difference. Those loose ties actually do make a difference to a lot of people. And then for other people, it's this idea of not realizing how important friendships are.
Yeah.
That disconnection and how much value they place on face-to-face interactions that really threw them, especially when we had to go for a long period, really just communicating in a digital way.
Yeah. There was an interesting phenomenon last year. We have what's called FOMO, the fear of missing out, which for me slightly adjusted to something called JOMO, the joy of missing out, as I learnt to really understand and enjoy my solitude. What's the difference between loneliness and solitude?
Good question. Solitude and this joy of missing out. Sometimes it's about how you feel. So loneliness is an undesired state. Yeah. It is an unpleasant feeling. It's not something that you want to feel. Whereas, when you're alone and you're in solitude, it's the choice and the decision and to recharge, to feel peaceful, to feel calm, to really embrace yourself in reflection and deep thought, and a lot of people desire solitude, and that's okay as well. Not everyone would be as equally predisposed to feeling lonely.
Yeah. What tips do you have for people who might be experiencing loneliness?
Okay. But when people are lonely, I think it's really important for them to reach out in a way that helps them feel, it increases their best chance of actually having that meaningful connection. Yeah. So it's really important for them to think about what they need first and actually how to ask it, because we do know from research that people who are lonely often feel like they are a burden. And so even though they might feel lonely, they might actually, the way they ask for help and the way they ask for, this need for connection is very soft. Yeah. Rather than saying, hey, Leon, I really feel, I need to connect with someone. Do you have time? It's really important that I connect with you. I feel like we haven't had a chat in a while. Yep. That's much more direct than, oh, hey, Leon, are you free? If you're not free, don't worry about it.
I'm so guilty of that. When I've wanted to reach out, I feel more like that guy goes, you got some time,
Yeah, exactly. And that's where people, just react, oh, it's not that important. So, no, actually, I don't have time. I have all these things I have to do, but how about 2 weeks from now? Yeah. And that's just not helpful. And being really able to express it very clearly, but in a way that you feel comfortable, in a way that, that people can respond and can actually understand. Those things are critical. And the other thing really is that we need to start not stigmatizing ourselves, because I think a lot of people who feel lonely feel like there's something wrong with them. Yes. But there's nothing wrong with them. This is actually just how they're built. And yes, some people might be more predisposed than others, but it's really important when you feel lonely, don't think that something's wrong with you or that no one wants to be friends with you. What's more important is to actually think about how you can then do those active reach out in a way that could help you. And it could be sometimes even just going with the connections that you already have. So you don't have to go and make a new friend. You don't have to be ambitious and start making 5 friends. Yeah. It's very much about how do I change this conversation with an acquaintance into something deeper? Yes. How do I improve the relationship with my parents? Yep. Those sorts of things that kind of it's a little bit more palatable and digestible and easier to do, as opposed to just these massive, strange, unachievable goals in terms of friendships.
Absolutely. I found myself having to hone in on those acquaintances I had who I thought they will be really good friends, and just doing a bit of work into actually developing and deepening that friendship. And that paid off last year.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because COVID in many ways is a shared experience, isn't it?
Yes.
So it gave us an excuse to say, oh my God, I'm lonely, without the judgment, totally. Because everyone was in the same position. Yeah. And this is some of the research around community connections and getting to know your neighbors. Yeah. Those, we might shift even like, we start to get to know people we live with a little bit more because we're working from our homes a lot more. Yeah. That we never used to say hi or bye to lose connections like our neighbors, and now we know their name, and now we've probably helped each other out at some point. So I think COVID was a terrible thing, but it provided opportunities for us to almost tweak our social interactions a little bit.
Yeah, it did help a lot. I found that there were lots more connections that were made that were unexpected. Neighbours, especially for me, there were some really beautiful bonds that happened.
Yeah, and that's great. And it's really important for us to keep nurturing those relationships, because I think that some people do forget that relationships are all about that nurturance and that maintenance. And it doesn't have to be big gestures, but it's the things that we do a little bit over time that actually do make the difference, as opposed to those big gestures.
Absolutely. A lot of little nudges make for a big movement. Well, thank you so much for joining us. That was a real pleasure to talk to you. And loneliness is something that can be overcome. Do you have any resources that you can point us towards, Michelle?
Look, the Ending Loneliness Together website is a great resource, but also if you need more assistance, it's really important for you to find the right person to talk to, a confidant. If it's not someone in your network, perhaps looking for a professional if that's something that works for you. So you can also go to the Australian Psychological Society or to your GP to talk about what those options look like for you. But if you want tips and resources, the Ending Loneliness Together website will be releasing a set of resources very soon.
Brilliant. So that's www.endingloneliness.com.au.
That's right.
Thank you so much for joining us, Michelle. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Leon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You're listening to It's a Minefield.
Run by a bunch of crazy people. Hey everyone, I'm Caroline Savransky and you're tuning into the Club Mind segment of It's a Minefield. In this part of the show, we chat to 3 people with lived mental health experience and hear them reflect on the interview you all just heard. Today's topic was loneliness with Dr. Michelle Lim. Loneliness has a heavy correlation with both mental and physical health and is a feeling so many people feel they need to experience, ironically, alone. So today we have Shifra, Elizabeth and Jewel joining us to share their insights. Thanks so much for joining us today. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Yes, my name's Shifra. I'm 30. I'm studying full-time. I'm working part-time in research with experience research. And I would love to share my insights with everyone here.
I'm Jewel. I am 55 and I am a nurse working in mental health.
I'm Elizabeth. I'm not working in mental health. I'm struggling to live through it. I'm 68 and I've fallen out of the workforce because of mental health. Some years ago, I used to be a solicitor.
Thanks for joining us. Thanks for sharing that. So Michelle spoke about loneliness versus social isolation, and people speak about being in a room full of people and still feeling lonely. Does that resonate with any of you?
It doesn't resonate with me anymore, but that was definitely an overwhelming problem for me when I was younger. As I've got older, I realised that the social pressure I felt is off. Like if I go to a movie alone now, I see other people my age by themselves and I don't feel lonely. But before I felt really stigmatised if I do something by myself when everyone was with their friends.
I'm glad you're at that point in your life. For me, I think I still feel that feeling often, even though I'm at a point in my own recovery where I'm managing really well and I'm achieving everything that I want to. I think it's because I live with a mood disorder. I have those times where I just feel like really empty and alone. And when I go to sleep at night, I just feel like overwhelmed by, I don't know, like this sense of just how do I sleep and just feeling really alone.
Elizabeth here, and I can identify this. But I think the loneliness that I mainly feel is that when I'm really, really struggling, I'm aware that there's some people who are fortunate enough to have a partner or a best friend that they can always turn to, talk to, that if they were desperate in the hour of the day or night, they could contact. And I don't have such a person. I have one or two people who say you can contact me, but at 2 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock at night, or if I'm feeling really suicidal, I don't contact people. I feel too much of a burden, or they wouldn't. I just don't feel like talking. I certainly don't find it helpful to ring services like Lifeline, so I don't do that. And that's the loneliness that I feel, is that I'm doing this journey alone.
Yeah, you're on such different paths with your recovery and how you're experiencing loneliness. I know from...
By the way, I don't think this is recovery. That's a bit of an issue for me, because I'm in the NDIS, and one of the vital elements of the NDIS is you must be able to prove that your condition has no reasonable chance of recovery. So I have trouble with that term, and I'll put that up front. I think it's fantastic where people manage to recover from mental illness. Really recover means cure. That means that they don't have any sign of it at all.
I have to disagree with you, Elizabeth. I've studied this, and there are very different understandings of recovery, and the movement of its coming out of the lived experience field isn't based on clinical recovery, isn't based on a cure, isn't based on living without any symptoms of mental health issues, isn't based on not going to hospital. It's about personal recovery, which is actually the foundation of what the NDIS is meant to be based. The framework is based on is personal recovery. Is about living with or without symptoms of mental health issues, and still achieving the goals and having a fulfilling life. So, but the premise is faulted in terms of actually accessing the NDIS. I completely agree. The language is faulted. It means it's framing it in a way of deficit, and it's putting people in this mindset of you have to be proving permanence of a disability, of a psychosocial disability, and B, multiple domains have to be impacted to a degree that they deem is appropriate to access the NDIS. But in terms of recovery, recovery means being able to live the life that you want to live with or without symptoms of mental health issues.
You're totally right.
This is true. Can I just say, before we get back on track, I really feel for you, Elizabeth, and I'm really sorry for what you're going through.
Thank you. And I stress that there is a loneliness caused because I'm alienated from the mental health movement, and I've been very involved in the mental health movement over decades, and so I've watched it over decades, and this particular element of it. So the fact that I cannot join in groups where that is a big push in us.
I understand. I get where you're coming from.
Thank you. That's really kind of you.
So I'm sorry to hear that you feel lonely even within the mental health community and amongst people living with mental illness. That must feel very isolating. Do you find community in or solace in any situation or company?
No, almost not. There's one or two people who with whom I feel comfortable about it. Yeah.
Michelle spoke about loneliness being a primitive driver to find meaningful social connections, and akins it to ignoring the driving need to drink water when you're thirsty. But do you feel it's an easy thing to do to just go out into the world and create meaningful connections when you crave it, when you need it?
Yeah, so for me when I was younger, it definitely was a drive to push me out there and to try to stop that feeling of loneliness. It didn't work very much for me though, because I wasn't very good at maintaining social connections.
So all of you seem to have varied experiences with loneliness and are at different stages of it currently. How have you all experienced loneliness during COVID and the lockdowns?
Surprisingly enough, COVID has not affected me in any big way. It's been a minor thing, if at all. And the reason was I really didn't have any social connections that I was cut off from. So it made very little difference. Yeah, so I guess I kind of thought now other people will start to experience and know what I've experienced. And I wasn't, not in a bad way, but it just, I thought, well, that will open their eyes a bit to make a more compassionate society.
I completely agree.
You think, are you experiencing that people are changing like that?
I think people are becoming more compassionate to empathise with loneliness and what it feels like to go through disconnection and just missing those smaller interactions with, that, coffee guy or whatever it is. But for me, it's been like I really miss seeing my friends. And during like my university break, like I was working full time and struggling so much with motivation and really low moods and just trying to focus on my dog and pole dancing and doing anything physical, getting out of the house to get through it. But yeah, the first weeks were really tough.
I think it was you who said, though, that you had thought that with COVID maybe people would become more aware of what loneliness is like. And have you observed that people have changed?
I think it's gone two ways. I've actually seen some people who have gotten so rude and overtly aggressive, but that would be the small percentage. And other people who have become more polite and aware of other people around them and are even traditionally like extra aware of everyone around them and more polite than usual, I guess. Yeah, I don't know.
I suppose I'm asking how much they're just attributing it to COVID, and so that you've got people who are constantly talking about when COVID's over, and I go, live in the moment, live today. and so they don't have the capacity, or they're not interested to interpret it in the wider sense of those of us who suffer from withdrawal situations because of
Well, I guess we don't know. We just don't know because people living in families, their kids are going through it. They're having to juggle so many priorities. The kids might be doing the HSC and they're seeing the impact it's having there. Like, we just don't know what's going to be the outcome of whether they become more compassionate. Like, there may be studies that are going to be done about trying to compare and see whether people are actually more aware and of mental health issues after COVID situation. And
so a lot of people experienced loneliness for the first time during the pandemic. And people with lived mental health experience often have experienced it like many times during their life. So it wasn't a new feeling. And it sounds like all of you have experienced loneliness throughout your life long before COVID was ever in the picture. And Leon spoke about JOMO, the joy of missing out, rather than FOMO, the fear of missing out. And I know I personally felt JOMO sometimes during lockdown, the joy of missing out, because when I have times of poor mental health and I just can't get out there and participate in social events, I would feel sad and like see photos online and stuff like that and just feel sad that I was missing out. Did any of you feel like there was a weight lifted off you to socialize when you weren't feeling up to it? Because nobody was socializing.
Yeah, this is Jewel. I definitely felt that and was happy about it.
I don't think I felt that because I'm a social being and I really thrive on those connections. So it's not that I was looking at Instagram thinking I'm missing out and want to be there, but I just miss catching up with my friends in person.
I had been a very extrovert person, but COVID hasn't made much difference from what's happened before for me. But I don't have any I don't do any social media, so I've got 5,000 unread emails. So I don't need any more.
Good on you.
And I've got so many things I need to be doing that. I've got a time pressure on me. But if I go for a walk in my suburb, I will see people I know or even people I don't know. Hello, how are you? I mean, I know we're not supposed to gather, but at least, even just in passing, it's hello, how are you? And so I do that. And also I do ring people who I know are alone just to check and, hello, how you going? I do that.
I love your style, Elizabeth. Staying off the social media, not reading the emails. Sometimes you just got to do that for your mental health. I respect that. Because so many people were feeling lonely during COVID. Did you feel more comfortable speaking up about your loneliness when and if you did experience it during COVID?
This is Jewel, and I haven't talked about it. I don't like I said, it hasn't really affected me that much. I just am glad that other people may understand it more if they've experienced it because of the isolation.
Yeah, likewise. I think it's not because I feel more comfortable speaking about it. I think I've come to a place where I'm uncomfortable speaking about it, but it's more that other people are more comfortable speaking about it. So it's that kind of like, because they're able to speak about it more comfortably with me, then it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
I know we're running out of time, but I suppose I've learned in life that I don't have control over life, and so I get frustrated that most of the people that I'm in connection with are so frustrated and angry that they're not on their overseas trips that they were going to go on, or they can't see their grandchildren. They're so angry with all these things, and I just think, for goodness sake, you have such expectations of how life is going to continue, and also, if you're sat in psychiatric hospital, you have absolutely nothing to do there, and you have to learn to live with a zero level of being, and you don't have much contact with other people there these days. They used to years ago, but you don't now. So that's where I'm in a different space from those around me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Good point. It's a good point. It's a very good point.
So we just heard from Shifra, Elizabeth and Jewel reflecting on Leon Fernandez's interview on loneliness with Dr. Michelle Lim, who is the leading Australian scientific expert on loneliness, a practicing psychologist, and has a plethora of other amazing credentials under her belt. I'm Caroline, and thank you for tuning into Club Mind today.
Bye.
Great, thank you.
G'day. Tonight I have a couple of poems to read from my first published work, Bughouse Meat. The dreamer who butchered his arm to challenge his reality now butchers his reality to challenge his arm. My forearm is a wounded shark, a crippled highway, an imaginary tool, a nocturnal ballad of hieroglyphs, a battered birdwing, a supplicator, a bleeding ghost, the end of a lion's tyranny, an ancient crocodile skull, the nightmare and war of spring, a Catholic yak's exorcism.
Hi there, folks. My name's Chris Jager. In today's episode of Out of the Box, we're going to be talking about the Australian poet Ben Frater, who sadly passed away in 2007. Here to talk about Ben Frater's body of work is Tim Heffernan, a poet, peer worker, and the Deputy Commissioner at the Mental Health Commission of New South Wales, and Elise Blaney, Ben's partner and a poet, peer worker, and peer educator at the Recovery and Wellbeing College in Kogarah. Tim and Elise, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Chris. It's great.
Great. Thanks for having us, Chris.
No worries. Pleasure. First question for both of you, how did you both first come across Ben and his poetry?
So we actually met during the spring of 2005. So this was supposed to be both Ben and I's last year of a creative arts degree at Wollongong Uni. And it was actually in a class called Write 329, Contemporary Theory and the Practicing Writer. So this was the first class that I'd ever had with Ben, as he'd been returning back to Wollongong campus for 9 years, seeing he'd been in and out of the bug house, which is a colloquial term for the psych ward, and he had to keep deferring and redoing classes. So a performance artist called Catherine Sheaves was our teacher, who Ben actually formed a close bond with, along with her husband, Warren. So during this class, Ben actually noticed me sitting across the room. I actually had a maroon Jimmy Morrison bag under my feet. And he said that when he looked into my eyes, he knew I was crazy and he was instantly drawn to me. So, yes, it's a bit of a story. So what Alan Byrne, our poetry lecturer actually introduced us properly, and I started reciting T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, whilst also dancing the Melbourne Shuffle in the Creative Arts faculty hallway. But then we were talking, and we were also discussing our favourite Frank Sinatra songs. So randomly, as you do with someone you've only just met. So he later wrote a poem to me with the opening lines, "Anyone who can quote Eliot, dance the Melbourne Shuffle and sing Sinatra till their feet bleed is either going to turn me on or down. You are the tender trap, the trap of sepia light and nudity that lifts a fledgling junkie thin with suicide over the bridge and broken heights of epiphany. You may or may not be inadvertently my reluctant muse in the shape of a girl, pale with all her morning tragedies, whose rose is a muscle." So after our initial meeting, he then asked me for my phone number. And then he told me while he was travelling home on the bus from Wollongong to Campbelltown that he played the song Woman by John Lennon and thought of me. And then when he got home, he told his mum Denise that he'd met the girl he wanted to marry.
Wow.
So he then rang me up that night and we talked on the phone for hours and hours, especially about poetry. He then invited me to meet him at Hurstville on the weekend to have lunch and then go and see his father's hotel at the Greenacre Tavern. And then after that meeting, we became inseparable and we didn't spend one day apart from that time. So, yes.
That's a beautiful, magical story.
Yes. Thank you so much. I thought I'd like to recount it, to keep the memory alive. So thank you for allowing me the space to do that.
Yeah, it's such a vivid, beautiful story of like people falling in love.
There's a lot of magic around all this. I think. Like I didn't come to know Ben until after his death, and it was really around. I think I was washing the car or doing something out the front, and I had the radio on, Radio RN. It must have been about 2012 or 13. And there was a documentary came on by a journalist called Lisa Nicole, and it was called Prey Hotel. And it was all about Ben Frater, and there was a Elise Blaney in there talking about her love and Ben's poetry. And I was transfixed by Ben's poetry because there are a lot of recordings of him performing his poetry. And it wasn't long after that Elise and I happened to be working together or at a forum together in Sydney. Ended up with us performing some poetry, and Elise performed some of Ben's poetry, or we might have had it on film. And we realised that there was this connection there, and we then bonded through the work of Ben and made a pledge to take his poetry further and our own mad poetry further. And we've done that through a collaboration that we've done called the Clozapine Clinic, which is on the website of the Verity La. And we've done a few writing festivals, and we've published a number of poets on this space, this mad poetry space, and it's a magical thing. I think continuation of Ben's magic that we embarked on this creative mad journey.
The publishing venture you mentioned, the Clozapine Clinic, how long's that been going for, and what is it doing?
Yeah, we started in 2016. And so far, we've published 25 poets from all around the world who have a lived experience, of mental health issues. So not just poetry in all different genres, such as poetic prose, short fiction, creative non-fiction. So, it's been a fantastic platform, and it's actually the first of its kind in the world to have its own platform to celebrate the lived experience of writers who are wanting to howl and, celebrate their lived experience of mental health issues. as Tim was saying before, like there is a lot of magic around it all, and it was just so much synchronicity as well. Because we were at a peer work conference. I think it was called So You Want to Change the World.
Yeah, that's right.
And I didn't even know that Tim was a peer worker, and he didn't know that I was a peer worker, or that I was actually Ben's partner. And so, we met that day, and he's like, oh my gosh, I've been following Ben's poetry for ages, and I actually live in Wollongong myself. And we're both peer workers, so it kind of just solidified and became like this kind of fated event where it was actually meant to be.
Yeah, that's right. We first took it to the Wollongong Writers Festival in 2016, where we ran a workshop for mad poets, which was hugely successful at a little cafe called Jane's. And then we had a panel and a presentation of Ben's work via video. And it was like, people still talk about it. It was an incredible afternoon, that one, where we had some readings from some poets and Ben's work, and some homemade pizza. But it was just great. And then it was from there that we were connected with Verity La, with Michelle from Verity La, and the concept of the Clozapine Clinic, the Freighter Project came through.
Yeah, it's like such a beautiful idea, and a way to celebrate mad poets, and a way to celebrate Ben's work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've worked in hospitals, acute settings and rehab settings as a peer worker, and had people write poetry in those contexts as well before this sort of project. But people with experiences of mental health issues, whatever you want to call them, have just amazing insights into our world, and absolutely stunning and beautiful ways of expressing that through their poetry.
Yeah, they're like seers. It's like they can read the weather, like the psychic weather. They're like kind of aware of things before they even happen, and there's a whole like psychic element, I think, and there's quite a spiritual practice as well that goes along with poetry. So especially, when you're in some really challenging places trying to recover, such as inpatient units and acute wards, I think poetry more than ever is the best medicine. And it'd be great if we could, take mad poetry onto the wards officially and, move it through kind of the entire mental health system.
That'd be fantastic. And is that where the title of the Clozapine Clinic comes from?
Yes, that's right. So it was actually Ben's dream to start a poetry workshop while he was waiting for the Clozapine Clinic at Banks House in the hospital in Bankstown. So back in those days, people who were receiving Clozapine actually had to get their white blood cell count done on the day and then wait 3 to 4 hours for the courier to bring back the results, to check that they were healthy enough and their white blood cell level was okay for them to be administered their dose of Clozapine. And Ben and I found this deeply frustrating, and it was just really arduous, waiting in this hospital doing nothing for 3 to 4 hours.
All that dead time.
That's right. And people who are already, in high levels of distress, just sitting there, like casing the joint, walking up and down, there's nothing to do. Ben decided, well, I want to run a poetry workshop while the Clozapine Clinic is open. And so he actually approached his caseworker, Stuart, and Stuart agreed. So it was all going to be up and running. And then, unfortunately, he passed away. So that's why Tim and I decided to take on the legacy of Ben's dream and call it that. And then we were lucky enough to receive the publishing platform via Verity La to showcase the writer's works.
That's amazing that you're honouring that in such a such a meaningful way.
Absolutely. Like, I think he'd be so proud and honoured that we've been able to do that.
And I think he'd be pleased with, not knowing Ben, but I think there's a fair bit of irony in the use of the title Clozapine Clinic, because obviously it wasn't, it was the thing that hurt Ben in the end. But I think what we're trying to say with using it is again that beauty that can come out of adversity, I suppose, and it's about reclaiming those spaces that systems and pharmaceuticals can impose on us, and take back some of that language, I suppose, reclaim it and frame it positively rather than negatively.
What was it about poetry and writing that really captured Ben?
Vision. Ben was a surrealist poet. He saw the world through such unique eyes and such a unique mind, and I think he was so well read in that surrealist romantic poetry that he could bring so much of that legacy of the past poetry into his work, and it's just got layers and layers of meaning and beauty, madness and glory, all these things.
Performing poetry was also really important to Ben. What do you think it is about performance that was so important to him?
Ben loved performing, and he actually saw it like an act of ritual magic. And I don't mean ritual magic as in Harry Potter or summing up demons, but I mean it as a form of artistic and poetic philosophy which creates change in the material world. And I think there's a real beauty and also a cruelty of theatre to that. And Ben did love the Theatre of Cruelty by Antonin Artaud, which aimed to shock audiences through gesture, image, sound and lighting. And I think Ben was trying to emulate that effect whilst performing. And I think that's why his performances were so powerful, because it was as if he was creating a magical charge that transferred and then absorbed into the audience. I was saying before, it was so powerful. Like, you could literally feel it going right through you. It was as if his poetry and performance created this psychic charge that made you feel like instantly alive. And I think, his work was able to shock and confront the audience in a way that penetrated beyond words and connects with the emotions. And that's how his work provides that type of electricity which jolts the nerves. Yeah, I definitely believe he was performing acts of ritual magic without him even knowing it.
Ben's experience of schizophrenia and trauma, how did this inform his poetry and translate into poetry?
Yeah, so he actually said that when God gives you a gift, he also gives you a whip. And so he was referring to the whip as his schizophrenia, and the gift was his talent in poetry. So, yeah, anyone who reads his poems, like mental health and his experiences of psychosis and, him using the schizophrenia vernacular are heavily featured in his work. He saw poetry as self-medication, like as his first medication to deal with, the hallucinations, the voices, the psychosomatic symptoms. I also think that his mental health issues allowed him to do his shadow work very early on. Through words and poetry, he was working through his own psychic pain and transforming that into a kind of alchemic power and sorcery, because he was utterly obsessed with poetry, like it was his whole identity. And poetry was his religion. He saw the poet as a priest, There's a lot of occultic and esoteric references in his work. And I think he was living his own mythology in the subconscious through, generating what he called this visionary poetics and schizophrenic vernacular. He saw himself as a serious Australian poet and had plans to build his entire career out of that.
Thanks so much to both of you for contributing to this podcast, and it's been a really interesting, wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. It's been great.
Great, thank you guys so much.
Thank you for tuning in to It's a Minefield. This program has been kindly funded by the Mental Health Commission of New South Wales and broadcast all around Australia on the Community Radio Network. Produced by Caroline Savransky,
Leon Fernandez,
Chris Jager,
with executive producer Jeff Furlow.
You can reach out to us on Instagram and Facebook with the handle It's a Minefield, or get in touch via email info@iamf.org.au.
See you on the flip side, June bugs.